Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to the streets of the Pennsylvania town of Chambersburg, where on July 30th, 1864, chaos erupted after Confederate troops torched houses and businesses in retaliation for recent Yankee depredations in Virginia. One of the Confederate officers ordered to carry out the burnings is pictured here. He is First Lieutenant Fred Smith. His father, former Virginia governor and member of the U.S. House of Representatives, was William Smith, nicknamed Extra Billy. Now, young Fred had aspired to be a soldier since his boyhood in Warrenton, Virginia. He said, "My strongest preferences incline to the profession of arms, and I have been satisfied I could find contentment in no other profession." His goal came within reach in 1860 after he secured an appointment to West Point. The place, however, was promptly declined because, like any other good Southerner, I was utterly averse to receiving favors from a government on the eve of becoming bitterly hostile to my own people, Smith reportedly said. Disappointed but not defeated, young Fred entered the Virginia Military Institute, known as VMI, but found it impossible to continue his studies after the war began. He left VMI and enlisted in the 49th Virginia Infantry and advanced from private to sergeant major. His father, Extra Billy, was commander of the regiment. According to one officer, young Fred was, quote, "about the strongest marked case of second edition I ever saw," end quote, talking about the resemblance between father and son. They served together in many battles, including Antietam and Fredericksburg, where Fred suffered a wound, the nature of which went unreported. In the spring of 1863, he received an appointment as a cadet or junior officer with the rank of first lieutenant and aide to his father, who had recently been promoted himself to brigadier general. Father and son fought their last battle together at Gettysburg, not because one of them was wounded, but because Smith's father left the army in January 1864 to serve another term as governor of Virginia. Meanwhile, young Fred continued in the army as a staff officer to two brigadier generals. One, fellow Virginian Gabriel Wharton, who noted that Fred's, quote, "daring and cool courage won the admiration of all," end quote, and praised his rare capacity for controlling the men under his command during the Shenandoah Valley campaign. The other brigadier was VMI alumnus John McCausland. McCausland was a general in charge of executing the order to burn Chambersburg. Now, let's go back to Chambersburg on July 30th, 1864. Fred and a squad was one of many groups that were ordered to spread out across the town and elsewhere on that mission to destroy the city by fire. Now, there's two versions of the story that talks about Fred's actions during the burning. One of them, and the first one I'm going to share, is an oral story that's been passed down through the generations of Fred's family. It describes Fred as a noble man who had no choice but to follow McCausland's orders. Fred and the squad, so the story goes, approached one residence, and there they met a woman who begged him not to set fire to her home. Fred explained that orders were orders, and if he did not follow through, someone else would do so and he would be arrested. He also reasoned and told the woman that the order did not state that the contents of the houses must be included. So he very kindly offered to have his soldiers in the squad remove the furniture and other possessions before destroying her residence. Reportedly, according to the family, the woman was so grateful for young Fred's generosity, she accepted the offer with the words, "Sir, you are a true cavalier," and then went on to present him with two beautiful, large silver goblets as a token of her appreciation. And now I'm going to share you the other story. But before I do, remember the goblets. So the second story, this comes from a Chambersburg minister, a man of faith. His name is Reverend Benjamin Schneck. There was a story that he told, and he described himself as an eyewitness and a sufferer of the event in his narrative, which he published the same year as the fire, 1864. This slim volume is titled The Burning of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. According to Schneck's narrative, young Fred and a squad of cavalrymen targeted Norland. Norland is the stately home owned by Alexander K. McClure, who was a prominent Pennsylvania Republican. Now, I want to read the story in Schneck's own words because I think it has a lot more authenticity to it. And there's also some detail that is a little complex. So here we go. It's titled, the section of this book is titled Burning of Norland. So here we go. Soon after work of destruction had commenced, a squad was detailed to burn Norland, the residence of Alexander K. McClure. It is situated a mile from the center of the town, and no other building was fired within half a mile of it, although 50 houses stand between it and the burnt portion of Chambersburg. The squad was commanded by Captain Smith, son of Governor Smith, Extra Billy of Virginia, whose beautiful residence near Warrenton has ever been carefully guarded by Union troops when within our lines. The mother and sisters of the officer who fired Norland have lived in peace and safety in their home under federal guards since the war commenced. With the cry of retaliation, Captain Smith proceeded to Mr. McClure's residence. Passing the beautiful ranch of Mr. Eyster, Smith supposed he had reached the object of his vengeance, and he alighted and met Mr. Eyster at the door. "Colonel McClure, I presume," said the chivalrous son of Virginia. "No, sir. My name is Eyster," was the reply. "Where is McClure's house?" was the next interrogatory. As the property was evidently doomed and in sight, Mr. Eyster could only answer that it was further out on the road, and the noble warrior passed on. He found Mrs. McClure quite ill, having been confined to her bed for 10 days previous. He informed her that the house must be burned by way of retaliation, for what particular wrong he did not seem anxious to explain. He magnanimously stated that she should have 10 minutes to get the family out of the house and away, and to prove his sincerity, he at once fired the house on each story. To convince Mrs. McClure that he was a chivalrous foe, he ordered her to open her secretary while the house was in flames around her, and, evidently ambitious to show his literary taste and acquirements, he commenced to read her private letters. Mrs. McClure informed him that he would doubtless be disappointed in her assortment of literature, as her husband had no papers or letters in the house. But as Fred seemed desirous to read something, she would commend him to a letter she had just received the day before from a rebel prisoner, invoking the blessing of heaven upon her and hers for kind ministrations to a foe. The writer had been here in Chambersburg with Lee in June 1863 and was on guard at the house and was, of course, treated kindly. The sick of the same command, as well as those of McCausland's forces, then under General Jenkins, were all humanely cared for by Mrs. McClure, and the author of the letter, having since been captured and suffering from sickness and destitution, wrote her some time before stating his condition, that she had not turned a deaf ear even to a foe when suffering is evidenced by the acknowledgment presented to Captain Smith, which was as follows. Then the good Reverend Schneck copies the letter. It's dated Prisoners Camp, Point Lookout, Maryland, July 20th, 1864. Mrs. M.S. McClure, Madam, it is with feelings of intense gratitude I acknowledge the receipt of your letter under date of 21st June, enclosing XX dollars. Words are inadequate to express my gratitude for so kind, so benevolent, and unexpected a favor. I can only simply say many thanks and may God bless you. I have a mother and sisters, and your letter I shall return and convey to them in order that they may see the Christian kindness of one who is against us, and urge that they may emulate your example and never be backward when an opportunity is offered in giving aid to a needy federal soldier. As it may never be in my power to reciprocate the favor received at your hands, my prayer is that God may forward you for it. With best wishes for your health and happiness, and trusting that this dark war cloud may soon be dispelled, and peace and happiness and prosperity once more smile upon us, I am, Madam, with much respect, your obedient servant, James B. Stamp, Company C, 9th Division. That's the end of the letter. Such a letter, continued the Reverend, was not just the entertainment to which the imperious son of the South considered himself invited. Instead of retaliating for wrongs done, he found himself about to apply the torch where friend and foe had found solace in distress, even his own men having been mercifully ministered to there by the one whose over-aching head and enfeebled limbs he was inviting the fury of the flames. He read the letter. Young Smith read the letter and answered, "This is awful. It is awful to burn this house." And in vindication of his contrition, he left Mrs. McClure to escape from the fire while he proceeded to the adjoining room and, in a fit of remorse, stole Mr. McClure's gold watch and other articles of value. Fortunately, Mrs. McClure had some of her own clothing in a trunk, and one of the squad kindly aided her in getting it out of the house, and it was saved, but nothing belonging to Mr. McClure was allowed to be removed. Mrs. Reverend Nichols, who had rushed to the house, was caught on the stairs with a coat on her arms, and it was rudely taken from her with the remark, "Saving anything belonging to him," that's Mr. McClure, "is expressly forbidden." In 5 minutes, the house was enveloped in flames, and Mrs. McClure and the other members of the family at home started on foot in the heat of the day to escape the vengeance of the chivalry. The torch was thrust into the large, well-filled barn, and in half an hour, a few charred walls was all that remained of Norland. Captain Fred Smith could conceal the watch and other articles he purloined at Norland as trophies of his valor, but the silver pitcher was unwieldy and could not be secreted from the profane eyes as he rode back through the town from the scene of his triumph. He resolved, therefore, to give a public display of his generosity. He stopped at Reverend Mr. Kennedy's and handed the pitcher to his wife with the request, "Please deliver this to Mrs. Colonel McClure," that's Alexander McClure, "with the compliments of Captain Smith." The goblets were strapped to the saddle of one of his squad. Remember the goblets, and the watch could be pocketed to prevent the telltale qualities of the picture, and they were borne off to the land of heroic warriors and noble blood. So there's those two versions of the story, completely different versions of the story. So which one do you believe? Do you believe the version that was handed down to Fred Smith's family, his chivalrous act in which he received the goblets? Or do you believe the Reverend Schneck, who was obviously writing not long after the burning, and it's full of sarcasm? I don't know. Is the truth somewhere in the middle? Like many stories, that's probably the case. It does call into question the romantic ideals of the chivalrous Southern soldier and the Union men who were in the South, apparently taking care that Smith's home would not be burned or destroyed. So, what became of Smith? In early 1865, he applied for and received a promotion from cadet to regular Army first lieutenant. That's in the Confederate Army. Furthermore, he asked to join Colonel John Singleton Mosby for duty with his partisan Rangers. That request was also granted, and he likely served with Mosby's men until the end of hostilities. After the war was over, he left America for South Africa and remained there for the rest of his life. He lived a long time until age 85, dying in 1928. His wife, Emily, whom he married in 1900, survived him. If you go to Cape Town, South Africa, you'll find his remains. They rest there in a local cemetery. So thanks for listening. See you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.